So cortisol, the way to think about it is the main things that trigger cortisol are social stressors. So maternal separation, romantic partner separation. The bad thing about cortisol is that if you have enough, well, let me give you a social, since in serotonin we discussed about like social humans, let's look at social humans in cortisol. Cortisol and testosterone together determine like dominance, like the aggressive drive for dominance.
Okay.
So the cortisol, when it hits a certain level, that's when the person will kind of give up. So, you know, if you have high cortisol, low testosterone, you tend to be more, you fall into a lower rank in society. You know, less of a motivation to run.
If I'm getting more and more stressed, then I'm going to get more and more fearful. I'm not going to be confident, right? So there gets to be like a tipping point.
Yeah, so you go beta. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, because alpha males tend to be super testosterone, you know. Let's see. Now, the important thing to consider about cortisol, sort of in the background, is that it also suppresses your immune system. It changes the way it causes hyperglycemia, like more. It pulls sugar into your fight or flight system, so you can go, you can run, you know, fast sugar, you can run. But another thing is that it's also associated with flashbulb memories, like stuff you need to remember right now, like traumatic stress. But on the downside, chronic high cortisol is associated with impaired memory retrieval. So it dulls you also.
So are you saying difference between stress and getting excited? Like if I'm at the World Cup game right now and it's crazy exciting in a happy way, could that still be? Could I be releasing because of how?
Distress. That's eustress versus distress.
Okay.
So if you were excited, and this is when you start adding multiple neuromodulators. What they found is somebody doing involuntary exercise, they'll have the cortisol releases, etc., but they won't have orexin. Now, if you're doing voluntary exercise, you introduce orexin into the mix. Now, when you're introducing orexin into the mix, what it does is, and we'll talk about this more later, is you increase arousal, you increase metabolic rate management. So you're not, stress is the system overburdened. It's sort of a unit of representation that you're not in your best operating mode.
So last night, U.S. plays Portugal. Portugal scores first, and I'm immediately stressed, right? Like I'm like, oh no, we're in trouble, and so my adrenal glands are firing off, and there's cortisol flooding out into my system, and my heart rate's elevating. Now later on, the U.S. scores to equalize, and I'm euphoric. So now we going back to dopamine?
Dopamine is anticipation of reward on the way up.
Serotonin.
Yes, some serotonin, depending on, humans are more complicated.
Stuff that we talked about in the last, Yeah,
so serotonin, and I know you don't like me to add too many layers to it. It would be serotonin based on the level of identification, and we're talking about oxytocin also. Okay. Because if your team won, people do a lot of their attachment calculations, and we have the attachment video people can watch. Yeah. They do attachment calculations based on in-group and out-group. If a team is losing and you perceive yourself to have identified with that group, then you're distressing with the team. When your team is winning, you're going to get that warm, fuzzy, snuggly, bear hug feeling. You know?
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So it depends on whether you perceive the team to be yours or not. Identification mechanisms.
Because a lot of fans literally see themselves as having a relationship with their team. They identify as if they're in a relationship. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, it's vicarious goal satiation. Huh?
Yeah. So, I'm sorry, I made you digress there. So we'll bring you back to, so you're talking about fear-based stuff sometimes with stress, right? Like stress, so we're talking amygdala?
Yeah.
that goes back to our earlier episode where we covered different parts of the brain. So the amygdala handles more than one thing. But one of the things it handles is emotions.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And so,
now, that's a good point. Let me put this in. When the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, usually the prefrontal cortex can do what's called cognitive regulation of your fear, where you can talk yourself down, you could rationalize, you're like, oh, it's nothing that bad, don't get angry, cognitive reappraisal. But once you get this cortisol cascade, it breaks the attachment, the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, and it sets the amygdala free to seize, to start just firing off.
Okay.
And then, that's the amygdala hijack concept, where your lizard brain at that point, you're pretty much limbic system.
Right.
Yeah, so that's another role of cortisol.
You had mentioned to me before we got started that the adrenal glands are an important part of this. So I'm going to put up a photo so people can see. Your adrenal glands are sort of atop your kidneys?
Yeah, like renal is kidney, so adrenal is like nearby the kidneys.
Okay.
So there's a region called the zona fasciculata. I remember I hated learning that in med school. Because there's like 3 layers in there, and I was like, really? You're going to put extra info in there? But yeah, that's where you get your cortisol produced. And so that's part of what's called the HPA, hypothalamic pituitary axis. So the stress axis is the HPA. It's sort of this cascade so that the signals from your hypothalamus go down and tell your kidneys, your adrenals, to give you the cortisol bath.
So wait, because this is, again, not being someone who went to med school, I want a little clarification on behalf of other folks who didn't go to med school, and I also just want to sort of celebrate the amazingness that is the human body. So you're telling me cortisol is coming from the adrenal glands?
Yes.
And that's, just at the risk of being redundant, we're talking all the way down in my lower back, and it's getting all the way up to my brain. So we're going from here they are atop my kidneys, and you can see the silhouette of a whole person. And I mean, we're talking lightning fast, right? Like stress.
Yeah, it's like a wave, because it's a hormone, so it just,
Yeah.
When you freak out.
From there up to the brain and stuff firing off. And so the amygdala, the adrenal glands, and I'm somewhat in between, right? I mean, what's in between?
You have your HPA, which is hypothalamic pituitary axis, and you have the last kind of messenger is ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So there's a signal that comes from your brain when it interprets the context as a threat, social threat, life threat, and it sends the signal down through 2 feedback mechanisms all the way down to the adrenals. The adrenals give the body the thick blood of cortisol.
It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. Amazing. So if people, I mean, and this is another, one of the things I love about talking about this stuff with you is I really feel like what we're laying out foundationally in these episodes is stuff that we're just going to come back to over and over again, because here we are really we're talking about cortisol, but we're talking about stress. Yeah. And I mean, stress is so pervasive in our culture today, and stress is causing people to eat unnecessarily, and it's causing people to smoke, and it's causing people to have debilitating habits like terrible chewing of the fingernails, or trichotillomania where they're pulling their hair out, or compulsive gambling, right? It goes on and on and on.
Yep.
So, we're starting with this simple thing of so you've got this part of your brain that deals with fear, and it fires off other parts of your brain and your hormonal system, your endocrine system, adrenal. I mean, there's a lot going on, but at the same time, it's
crisp.
It's sort of. Go ahead.
It's crisp. It's simple.
Yeah, right. It is.
You gotta look at each piece. Yeah. You gotta be like, okay, I hear the violins, I hear the drum, I hear the banjo. When the drum goes faster, the rhythm has accelerated. It's being aware that when all these different elements play together, what you have is an emergent phenomenon that is greater than the individual parts. It's like if you have cake and you don't put the eggs in there, you just have flour and milk. You know, you have paste.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Any last thoughts or things that you feel like you need to include about cortisol today?
It's one to keep in mind. I'd say it's one of the key elements that you want to keep managed. You don't want to be walking around the bath with cortisol because it interferes with everything else. Interferes with memory, interferes with function, interferes with social functioning. It makes you just feel awful, makes you put on weight, makes you think less effectively. It's just overall you want to work towards good cognitive reappraisal, reframing ability, stress coping skills such that you don't walk around all day chronically elevated cortisol.
Right. So again, this is, I think, one of the things that I'll pat us on the back a little bit. I think one of the things we're doing well, I feel like the more I talk with you, is we're focusing on things that do have this everyday benefit to learning about. That if you can really, once you understand just something as simple as what cortisol is and what it does, and then you take some of the earlier stuff we've talked about, like mindfulness, you can start to develop some skills for how to manage this in a way that will actually make your life better.
Absolutely. What's important about it, and this goes back to the name it, tame it concept, the brain doesn't like uncertainty. And in a large part of our history, people have been able to get away with things because they weren't measurable. And now we're at the point where if you're psychologically battering someone, we can check their salivary cortisol and see that you're stressing this person. If someone was abandoned by their parents, 60 years later, you could check and their cortisol cycles indicate that this person had early life stress. The cortisol changes your default mode network, which is sort of your ego incarnate, It changes, it affects a lot of things.